Hey, what's up guys? My name is Clinton Jones and I've been creating viral action comedy VFX based short films on YouTube for the last 10 years. And I've had the pleasure to work with some of the most creative, talented, and downright passionate groups of filmmakers on the internet. And even though some of them just love chucking dodgeballs at my head at full blast, Ren, dude, I still love you, man. So to Paul, Matthias, and Rick over at Maxon, you guys have been incredibly supportive of my passion over the last 2 years. So it truly is an honor to be presenting on behalf of Maxon today. And to you guys at home, thank you so much for spending the next hour with me. And if you guys enjoy the next hour, then head on over to my YouTube channel where I live stream Cinema 4D knowledge for you guys every single Saturday. So the big question, how do you make a CG element look indistinguishable from the real thing? Right? And once you've modeled and textured something that looks legit, how do you integrate it into your live action footage? So over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to walk you guys through my process when tasked with adding a photoreal CG element to your live action plate. And we'll get started with shooting your footage. So you want to have a plan in mind when capturing your live action plate. What are you adding to your footage? How big is it? Will it move around? Or is it going to be static? Will any real shadows pass over your CG element? Or will the fake shadows interact with anything else besides the ground? Are there enough natural tracking points in your scene, or do you need to throw some down? The more specific you can be with what you're shooting, the less headache you're gonna have to go through in the post-process. And once you've decided what to shoot, there's a couple camera settings you need to keep in mind. Frame rate, aperture, shutter speed, focal length, those are a couple things, right? So generally, a higher shutter speed, a higher aperture, and a smoother camera move make for an easier track. So the more you shoot and track footage, the more liberties you can take while filming. Just know that the time spent tracking may double, triple, quadruple, it all depends on the shot. So don't go too insane, right out the gates. Once I've shot my footage, you'll want to capture some sort of real-world reference. Even if it's just me standing there, reference provides us with a number of real-world truths we can use to guide our CG elements towards that photorealism we're all shooting for. So if you guys want to get really, really fancy, all right, you're going to want to capture a custom HDRI. And this is definitely a step not to be missed if you have the opportunity to do so. It allows us to actually light our CG object with the real environment we shot our footage in. And it also ensures that our reflections will reflect that same environment, and is achieved by capturing a series of bracketed images of your environment from a tripod that will later be stitched together into one 32-bit high dynamic range image. And if you guys want to know how to create your own custom HDR images, there's a link to my YouTube channel in the description, and you guys can follow the exact process that I use. So I'm inside of Cinema 4D R22. This is a brand new blank slate, blank scene here. This should look pretty familiar to you guys. If not, no worries. Let's start motion tracking our footage. If you look to the top right, Cinema 4D actually comes with some really handy layouts. If you hold this down and you go down to motion tracker, it's going to present you with a new layout that's totally optimized for 3D tracking. It's really, really nice. You'll see here, if you double click to create a motion tracker object, we'll do that. And you're presented with some new options down here, right? We can load our footage in. We have the 2D tracking tab. You can do automatic or manual tracking, and the 3D solve, which turns your 2D points into 3D points and creates a virtual camera for you. So we'll want to go to footage here and load in our footage. You can do that by clicking this button here, or you can just double click up here and we'll select our shot, and it's loaded in. It's going to play a little chunky because we hadn't actually cached any of these frames. So if you look down on the bottom right, scroll down just a bit, you can see our footage was loaded here. The dimensions of our footage, 3840 by 2160. Now it's downsampled to 640 by 360. And usually you want to track footage that isn't too low res here. This is a little too low res for us, I think. So if you go to resampling, you can actually go, say, 50%. And that'll downsample it to 1920 by 1080. We want to cache these frames. So the easiest way to do that is just hit play. And the first pass through, it's going to be a little chunky, a little laggy. That's because it's caching these frames down here. Great, so now our frames are cached and we're able to actually play back our footage. So we know this is a solid representation of our footage because we can see our frames per second down here. And if you guys want to see this in your HUD, you can actually hit Alt-V. And right over here in the HUD tab, you can just check your frames per second along with some other really handy checkboxes here like total objects, total points, and you'll see those up here in the top left. So So the tracking process always begins with a 2D track. And the way this works is basically, depending on how these 2D points move around in space, right? Depending on the foreground is going to move different from the background. The midground will move a little bit differently. Then it'll take those points and convert it into a 3D solve. So we're going to auto track this because the auto tracker is actually really, really nice. So basically the way this works, you can either track backwards, you can track forwards, or you can track in both directions at the same time. And that's what we'll use for this shot here. We'll auto track it. The create auto tracks, that's useful when you have like a feature that comes in from frame right and then you're panning across, it leaves frame left, and you never see that again. You just want to scrub through your footage and create auto tracks all the way through, and that helps the tracking process. But for our case, we're good with auto track. So let's just auto track this scene. And if you look down here, we can see Cinema 4D thinking real hard. Your program's not frozen, it's just thinking. And there you go. If we scrub to the beginning, we can see we have a healthy amount of tracks at the beginning of our footage. Right in the middle, we have a whole bunch. And towards the end, there's still a healthy amount. To make this a little easier to see, right? Because these points, I mean, honestly, I'm colorblind, just straight up. So it is hard to see these points down here. So what I'll do is I'll go to options and track display. We can just turn that to show tracks only. Still hard for me to see this though. So we'll go back to footage and I'll take the brightness down to like 30%. Then I can see these points, so much better. And some of them are clicking in and out. That's okay. They're going to hang on for dear life for as long as they can. But the ones that are sliding around, like let's see if we can find one that slides like this guy right here. And this is also another really cool thing that Cinema does here is you have this tracker view and you can scrub through and see where things gets off. You can see it slide right there. Oop, no good. That one's got a mind of its own. Let's delete it. Boom, gone. So once you've scrubbed through your footage and are happy with all of your 2D points here. Again, it doesn't need to be exactly perfect. You'll be here till next Christmas doing this. You can actually just navigate over to the 3D solve button here, and you're presented with a couple more options. So the solve mode, full 3D reconstruction, this is basically like a free move, as in our camera is moving freely through 3D space, like in real life, you know? A nodal pan is a special type of track, and that is a track that takes place when you have a camera on a tripod and it's just panning or tilting around your scene. That's when you'll want to switch it to a nodal pan. Planar track is just another type of special tracking mode, but we're going to do a full 3D reconstruction. And here is a spot where we can plug in a known truth, our focal length. We'll set that to known and constant. Our focal length, I know I shot on a 24. And your sensor size, you can actually Google your camera and its sensor size, and it'll tell you, for my camera, it's the Sony a7R II, and I believe the sensor size is 35.9, but I'm just going to leave that at 36. That should be fine. Now, all we have to do here is run the 3D solver, and you'll see it thinking down here in the bottom left. Give it a minute or two. And the solve is finished. If we click off of the motion tracker, we should see all of these green and red points in our scene. Let's scrub through and make sure things look great. And sure enough, it looks like they do. So obviously our position and rotation is way off, and I'm betting our scale is off as well. So the next thing we need to do here to make the rest of this process super easy on us is normalize our scene. We want to get to the point where we can spawn a figure, and when we hop into the camera, it's sitting right in the middle, right on the origin, it's scaled properly, and it's oriented properly. So with the motion tracker selected, we're presented with a new option here. If we hold this down, we have 3 options. We're able to adjust the position, and we can actually select which axis is which axis. That way Cinema 4D knows which way is up, down, left, and right. So we'll start with a position constraint, and that's basically allowing us to choose the origin point, the 0, 0, 0. So I'm just going to scrub forward, and I'm going to select this point right here, and you'll see this new constraint was created. And the mode by default is set to feature to position. That means the feature, or the 2D point, goes to a position of 0, 0, 0. So if I click away, that figure we created is now sitting right at the origin point, which is exactly what we want. This is going to make things super easy on us when we're going and placing a new newspaper stand that we're going to model in a second. But obviously the orientation is off, so we need to set that next. So let's select the motion tracker and hold down the constraint button, and we'll create a vector constraint. Okay, so we want to find 2 points that are on a certain axis. In our case, let's find the x-axis that's going from left to right. Now we could choose these points here. Basically, any 2 points that are on a specific axis are fair game. So I'll select this one here, select this one here, and it's going to create this line. And over to the right, we are asked a couple questions here. So we'll want to take this axis and define it as the x-axis. So if we click away now, we can see our figure is lined up almost. We just need to determine a z-axis or a y-axis. Let's go back to the motion tracker, and we're going to make another vector constraint. 1, 2. Let's hop over to axis and say that is the z-axis. And now when we click away, it's basically perfect. We just need to mess with the scale, but that looks solid to me. So the reason I like using a figure is it gives me a really good sense of scale. You know, this comes in at just under 2 meters. I'm 5'9", so this thing is probably just as tall as me. And this actually allows us to reference the footage of me walking into place here and seeing how tall I am, and we'll just walk it in by eye. Let's select the x-axis constraint that we created, and we'll go to length here. We'll say we know it. And I'm just going to guess here that from here to here is, I don't know, 3 feet. And now the size looks locked in. Just fidget with that number until the scale looks right for you. So once I've 3D tracked my footage, the next thing I want to do is set up my lighting so that whenever we bring in assets, or in our case, when we model a newspaper stand, things are just looking good by default. So you ever see those guys on set with like a reflective chrome ball, and then they have like a matte gray ball, and ever wonder what they're doing with those? Well, basically they're capturing real world reference. And if you can recreate that real world reference in 3D, then that means your lighting is basically good to go. So we're going to do that here in Cinema 4D. We can hop back out of this layout, and let's go ahead and hide these auto features. We can hide our figure, and I'm just going to hold down this cube here. We'll spawn a sphere, and let's go up to 100 segments, and we'll give it a radius of, I don't know, 1.5 feet. And we'll raise it off the ground by 1.5 feet. So it's just sitting perfectly on the ground there. And I use Octane as my renderer of choice, but you guys can follow along. All the same tips and tricks apply, like if you're using Redshift. And I'll actually briefly break down some of the Redshift equivalents before we composite in After Effects. Let's just go ahead and make a new Octane glossy material and drop it onto our sphere. And let me load up another layout I have where you guys can actually see what's going on here. Let's render the scene. And right now we're just getting this image here. So let's go ahead into our material. We'll go to index and we'll set the index to 1. That's going to turn it into a perfect chrome ball. Nothing's changed here because we don't have an environment that this sphere is reflecting. So let's go ahead and load in an environment here. I'll load in an Octane sky, and we'll go ahead and grab our custom HDRI image that we made. And now it's actually reflecting that image. So what we'll want to do is compare the reflection of our HDR environment here with a animated JPEG sequence of our background. So we can double click down here in the material window, and we'll double click that new C4D material. Under the color tab here, I'm just going to drop down this arrow and load up the JPEG sequence of our footage that I exported from After Effects. So we need to make a couple tweaks to get this JPEG sequence to actually play in our viewport. So first I'm going to go to the floor button, we'll make a background, and we'll drop that new material onto our background. And you can see actually that it's in our live viewer, but it's not in the viewport. And the reason it's not in the viewport is because the Octane sky is blocking our view of that. So if we just hide the Octane sky, now we can actually see our background loaded in. And if we scrub through here, it doesn't work. It's not a JPEG sequence, it's just one frame. So what we need to do is actually click this little icon here, and it's going to bring up this new window. Let's click animation up here at the top, and down at the bottom, only when you click calculate will it recognize your material as a JPEG sequence.
And if your numbers look all crazy like mine, you just need to make sure that you set your start frame to 0 inside of the composition settings in After Effects before you render. And we should be able to scrub through here and see our JPEG sequence. And it actually shows up here in the live viewer as well. So by default, we can see that our HDRI image is too saturated and too contrasty. So we'll need to adjust that. I'll click on the environment tag here, give us a little bit of room, we'll scroll down and we'll click this button here, and that takes us to node view. I'm gonna scroll down, grab the color correction node, drop it right in between, and from here, we can actually start adjusting some of these values to better match our HDRI environment to our live action plate. So let's do saturation 0.8, and I'll just render region here. Let's take the gamma 0.8 as well. It's a little bright, so we can take the brightness down to 0.6 maybe, 0.7. And we're getting pretty close. I still feel like it's a little saturated. And that looks like a match. The last thing we need to do is just adjust its rotation. And I'll throw a UV transform on this guy. And I'll just scroll this around until we're looking at this back wall, because that's what's behind me filming, right? If I go over to direct lighting, you can see we're looking in the correct direction down the street. So the last thing we need to do to set up our lighting is create a sun and a ground plane where the shadow can be cast across the ground. So I'm going to hop back into camera view here. I'm going to go ahead and lock the scene. We'll set this to 0.2 so we can see what's going on. Let's create a plane, and I'm just gonna hit T and make sure I'm in model mode here, and we'll scale it up, and I'll create an octane diffuse material, go to common, and check the shadow catcher option. We'll go ahead and drop that onto the plane, and we can see here it's catching our shadow. If I hide the background, you can see here that we're just rendering our element and the shadow. Usually I'll take the plane and I'll hide it in the viewport just so it's a little easier to see. So the last thing we'll need to do to set up our lighting is to create a sun. So I'll make an octane daylight here. If you guys are using Octane, you can go to Objects, Lights, Octane Daylight. And now we want to just line up our sunlight with the actual direction of the sun in our HDRI environment. So I'm going to hop out of camera view here. And let's look at a lower view. We need to hide our plane from the renderer. And let's switch over to direct lighting. If we hit the daylight tag and scroll down, there's a little checkbox here, mix sky texture. We'll check that. It's going to take the directional light from the sun, but it's also going to fill in the environment with our custom HDRI. So you're getting the best of both worlds. So this line is pointing in the direction of the sun. So if I hit R and rotate this, let's bring our plane back in. We can kind of see what's going on here. And if I hit W, that'll switch my Octane Daylight gizmo from local to world space. And now we can just orient it around like this. Now we need to make sure it's coming from the right position. So if we navigate around and we see the sun is coming from that point, there's our Octane sun. So in world orientation, I'm just going to orient it around so that it perfectly matches. So if we go to our color correction node, by clicking this image, we can take the brightness all the way down and just get a better idea of where our sun is at so that we can walk it into place here. And now it's perfectly lined up with the HDRI environment. So let's bring this back up to 0.7 and hop into camera view. All right, so now that our lighting is all set up, we can drop in anything here and it's automatically just gonna look nice. The shadow's a little dark, but we'll deal with that in After Effects. Okay, so now it's time to finally model a newspaper stand so we can drop it into our motion tracked scene. Before we do that though, I just want to set up a quick layout with you guys with some custom buttons so we can make the modeling and workflow process a lot smoother and a lot faster here inside of Cinema 4D. There's a couple ways you can do this. You can just hit Shift C and look up anything you want here. In our case, let's try the center axis tool. And all you have to do is click and drag and you'll see this little gray strip, let go, and there it is. The other way is you can go up to Window, Customization, Customize Commands, and do the same thing. You can just type out whatever you want. Let's try the Transfer tool, and that transfers one model to another. Makes it really easy to move things around. Another one of my go-tos would be Set Selection, and that basically allows us to select a number of points, polygons, or edges, and make certain tweaks to just those areas. Another classic I always go back to is the Axis Center tool. It basically allows you to move the pivot point anywhere around your model. And the last thing is Reset PSR. That's Position, Scale, Rotation. And that'll just snap anything you have selected to the origin. Now, if we close out of Cinema, these buttons will disappear. So what we'll have to do is go to Window, Customization, Save Layout As. You can name it whatever you want, some custom thing. Or you can go and save it as your startup layout, so that every time you boot Cinema, you have these buttons ready to go. So when modeling, I will always use reference, and this will actually carry into the texturing phase too. You want to be able to reference the real world thing rather than just guessing, what you think it looks like. And that is actually going to take our VFX shot, our model, to the next level, because I think the average person can tell when something just doesn't look right, if something just doesn't function, So always use reference photography when creating stuff from scratch here. And when you begin the modeling process, you never want to dive right into the details. You'll want to start by blocking out your model with primitives first. So I'll spawn a cube here, and I'll actually spawn a figure, so we know the size we're working with. We know that the top of it comes about up to the belly button. So I'm just going to take this cube, hit T, and scale this thing down, and I'm going to start with the base here. So let's scale it down, something like this. And I think in this case, we can just hit C to make it editable. And now here is a great little tip. You can see that the anchor point is right in the middle of this cube, right? But we want the anchor point to be at the bottom. So that's why we have this handy tool here, the Axis Center tool. We're going to take the Y-axis and we're going to slide it all the way down to the furthest point on the bottom here. So it's -Y. We'll hit execute, and you're going to see that anchor point just snap right to the bottom. That way, when you're in model mode, you can just set Y to 0, and it's going to be sitting right on the floor. If you hold down Control with this object selected, with any object selected, you'll spawn your new primitive right in the place of the primitive that you had selected or the object you had selected. So I'm just gonna hit W to get my move tool going here, right? So using the reference imagery, I know that the body of this thing is a little bit longer on the X-axis than it is on the Z-axis. Right? And I'm going to make this cube editable by hitting C. Another thing here, guys, you really want to learn your shortcuts. The more shortcuts the faster you'll be able to work in Cinema. I always think of it as like, you start a new program and you can barely crawl. You're just laying down on the ground. But eventually, you'll start crawling, then you'll start walking, you'll start jogging. Eventually, you get to the point where you can run, you can jump really high, and then you can fly. And you want to get to the point where you can fly around in this program, and learning your shortcuts is definitely a great way to do that. I'd say it's mandatory. So I'm going to hit K, and you see L for loop path cut. I'm going to hit L. I'm going to make sure I'm in edge mode here. And I just want to make a cut here because, again, we're just going off of the reference. We'll grab this top point, and you can see how the anchor point is skewed at this 45-degree angle. That's because it is set to local orientation. If I hit W, that's going to cycle back to world orientation. So let's slide this back about right here. And I know there's like a little offshoot hanging from the side out over here. So I'll actually go to polygon mode, and I want to break this piece off, just this top piece. So the shortcut for that is UP, and that's a shortcut for split. We're going to break it up. All right, so we have that piece. I'm going to grab this edge, slide it out just a little bit. I'm going to make a cut here, and I'll make a cut here so that we can delete this polygon. And now we have our entire top piece right here. So let's go ahead and hide the main body. I'm going to go to edge mode, and UL is a shortcut for loop selection. So that's going to get the surrounding edges of this whole thing. If I hit W and I hold Control, I can make some new faces here just by clicking and dragging down. And this is basically going to be our topper. Now we'll bring in our main body again and orbit around here. So it has some lips on the side here. If I go to the main body and we'll go to edge mode, we'll hit KL. Again, that's a loop path cut. Let's do one there. Let's do one here. We'll go on the other side as well. Now we could do like a symmetry setup, but honestly, this is just going to go by so fast. I don't think it's going to be necessary. Okay, we're going to grab all 4 of these corners here. I'm holding shift to select everything. And then I want to extrude these out. So the shortcut for extrude is MT. So we'll zoom in, extrude those out so we have like a nice little lip there. That's great. And the top has the same deal. So we're going to do UL for loop path selection and MT for extrude, and just bring that out a little bit further so it just hangs over the edge of this thing. Now, the last main chunk is this little door here where you open it up and get inside for the newspaper. So let's select our main body, holding control. We're going to spawn a cube right at its center point. I'm going to hit T for scale and just drag this down. Okay, I'm going to hit W, bring the cube out, hit R for rotation, and rotate this. Let's go into a side view here. This will work just perfect. I'm going to make this cube editable, select these points, move them down, and you'll notice it only selected one of the points, right? So this is not correct. So we'll undo that, and we'll want to make sure that with our selection tool selected, only select visible elements is unchecked. It's going to get everything. It's just going to laser through it, and we'll just bring this down so it lines right up. Back in, let's select this face here, MW for extrude inner, and that comes in just a little bit here, and then MT, once again for extrude, we'll just pull this back. And just make sure this lines up flush with the edges of this newspaper stand. So I'm going to hit T for scale and just open this up so it reaches the bounds of the newspaper stand. So this is basically the idea. You just want to block this thing out so that we can get a general idea of what we're going for. That way we're not wasting time. We want to be as efficient as possible with our work. So I'm going to take this and let's go ahead and move it into our motion track scene to make sure our scale is right. We can select all of this, drop it into the null, call my stuff geometry. I'm just going to copy it, window over, and move it over to our motion track scene. I'm just going to paste that in there, and it looks a little small. So I've pulled some points around to match our model to the actual newspaper stand. From this point, we'll want to start detailing our model, which we don't have all the time for today, but I want to show you guys 2 last modeling tips, starting with the bevel modifier. Now, if you mouse over to the modifier button, we can hold this down and we're presented with a list of all the modifiers. We'll click the bevel modifier and we'll make it a child of our geometry. And by default, it's looking janky, so let's adjust this thing. But it is cool how the use angle button is checked by default in R22. Usually that'd be unchecked and it'd be beveling everything, even the stuff you don't want beveled, like this line here. But with the use angle checkbox, it knows, hey, we just want to bevel certain parts of the geometry rather than parts, you probably don't want beveled. So the offset is what controls the amount of bevel. I'll come in here and just go 0.1. And that's nice. That actually gives us a nice bevel. And it's a really good tip to bevel all of your edges because there's no such thing as a perfect 90-degree sharp edge. And when we bevel our edges, the light catches nicely on the sides. And that is definitely something you want to keep in mind when going for that photorealistic look. And we can set the subdivisions to something like 3. You can do 5, whatever you guys feel like is right for this thing. And you can always adjust this later. That's the beauty of the bevel modifier, is you're not baking in any geometry. This stuff is completely editable. If you get notes from a client, you're going to want to be able to adjust this stuff on the fly. And when you bake things in, you're kind of screwed. You're going to have to do it over. And another thing I like about the bevel modifier is the selection box. So let's go ahead and select all of our outermost edges that we want beveled. And we'll set a selection. So we made that button, our custom button for set selection, or you can go to select and come on down to set selection. And you can see right next to our model here in the objects window, we have this new icon, and it is the edge selection tag here. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go to our bevel and we'll drag that edge selection tag into the selection, and it's just going to bevel that little bit there. Now what I like doing is doubling up on this. So let's just set our offset to 0.5, but we still want a bevel on these edges too. So let's go ahead and up the subdivisions. Heck, we'll go to 10. And I'm going to control drag the bevel so it duplicates it, and it's going to look all weird. But let's go ahead and delete the edge selection, and let's readjust 0.1. And it's getting everything. So I think the hierarchy matters here. Let's move this bevel on top. And now you can see we have full control over the bevels that we have on our model. We're getting different kind of bevels, and they're completely adjustable. So definitely use these bevel modifiers when you can. It's going to save you a lot of time. You're going to be able to change things on the fly, and you're going to be able to have full control over your edges. Okay, and for the last bit of modeling tips for you guys, I just wanted to quickly talk about the volume modeling method here. We have the volume mesher and we have the volume builder. So since our newspaper stand has a ton of screws holding it together, I've set up this small scene just as an example to get us started. It's just a sphere set to hemisphere and a cube extruded out to this plus shape, which we'll use to cut into this hemisphere. So if we drop both of these objects into the volume builder, it's going to look like this 16-bit old video game kind of style looking here. What we'll want to do is grab the volume builder, and we want our cube on top. We want to subtract it, but it still looks wonky, right? Let's take our voxel size to 0.5 inches. Let's zoom in here. We can see that it's hollow, and that's not good. So we'll grab our sphere. Let's turn off the volume builder for a second, and we want to just close this hole. So I'm going to go to polygon mode, right click, and we will close polygon hole. MD for the shortcut there, and I'm always trying to come up with dumb ways to remember that. MD is like a doctor, they're patching holes, and you will hopefully never forget the shortcut for the close polygon hole tool ever again. The cheesier the better with those, usually works out. So let's bring that back in, and now you can see we got a nice little cut here. Now, obviously, that is super low poly. Now, the best way to fix that, if we go to sphere, I'm going to hold Alt and drop a subdivision surface. By holding Alt, you are making the object you have selected an automatic child of that new thing that you have created. Hopefully, that makes sense for you guys. Shift is the opposite. It'll make it a parent. Okay, so we want to still subtract. Wrong thing. We just got to get our order right again. Boom. And now it's looking a little bit better. If we take our volume builder, hold Alt once again, and we'll drop it into a volume mesher, it's going to take our volume and actually turn it into polygons that we can use. We can hit NA to change our shading method. Now we can see a little bit of those polygons in here. So you can hold Shift and drop in a smoothing modifier, and that can just smooth things out just right. And that about wraps up the modeling section of this presentation. I hope you guys can use those tools to speed up your workflow and give you guys more possibilities in your modeling process.
Generally, the more detailed you guys can get when it comes to modeling, the better. And the closer you can get to the way something is actually built, the better. And it all depends on how close your model is to the camera. If it's way in the background, then it can just be a block out, kind of a quick sketch type thing. But if it's up close, you're going to want to get real detailed with it, because that detail goes a really long way.
And the same is true for texturing. So let's talk about how to texture something and make it look legit. And the first thing I'll do is look at my reference material and see how this thing actually looks. Let's take a look at the attributes here. Now, there's inconsistencies in the color. There's dark parts, there's red parts, there's parts where it's like kind of orangish and reddish. There's definitely variation in all of that. There's some dirt on this thing. There is some variation in the way the paint builds up on this. There's dirt on the glass. The top of this thing is broken up in a really interesting way. Some parts are really rough. Some parts are a bit more shiny. I'm betting there's some fingerprints on this glass. And if we zoom in here, there's definitely some bump on the top of this thing. I know the top of this is warped a bit. We have scratches in the top of this. There are surface imperfections all across this newspaper stand. And that is one of the crucial steps not to be missed when going for that photoreal look, is surface imperfections. Nothing is perfect, guys. Like, look at all the smudges on this glass, how many times it's been wiped, how many times it's been cleaned, and then it's got dirty again. There's a bunch of rain residue built up on this thing. There's some grunge on this sign. The list goes on, and you don't want to miss out on these surface imperfections. They'll make your object look used and really tell a visual story. So what we're going to do is just build up a base material for this newspaper stand. We're going to go over color, we're going to get bump, we're going to get some normal in there, we're going to get some surface imperfections, and I'll just walk you guys through my process of how I do that. So I'm going to begin by lining up my camera to a nice position where the sun is bouncing off the top of this newspaper stand. That way we can actually see how the reflections and all the roughness is working. And I'm going to make a new octane glossy material. You can do that by just going to materials, octane glossy material, or once again, you can hit Shift C and search literally anything inside of Cinema 4D. Let's hop on in, and I'm going to apply this new material to the top of our newspaper stand. Now, the first thing we're going to do is work out of the diffuse channel. I'm going to grab an RGB spectrum, and let's pipe that into the diffuse, and we'll pick like a nice blue color here. Now we want to break up the color that we see here in the reference. There's points where we have darker red, we have like some brighter red going on, it looks like kind of like an orange. So I'm going to control drag that RGB spectrum. Let's pipe that new one in. It should look exactly the same, and let's just go ahead and change this a little bit. Not too crazy, probably go a little darker, maybe a little less saturated, and that should be good. Now we want to go ahead and mix these two colors together using a noise node. So I'll drag this out, and let's go ahead and pipe our noise into the diffuse so we can see what's going on here. Now it's a little bit difficult to see, so I'm going to right click this, solo the node, and we can see it a lot better. The mapping is a little bit off, so I'm going to make a projection node here, and I'll set that to XYZ to UVW, and that's going to wrap around this geometry really well. I'll go to the contrast, and I always max it out just so I can see what's going on. Now we want to mix these two colors together using a mix node. So I'll pull that out. We'll go texture 1, texture 2, pipe that into the diffuse. And if we disable solo, by default, it's just setting it up so that it's 50-50. The amount is set to 0.5. But we want to use this noise node to break up these two colors. So I'm going to pipe the noise into the amount. They're actually very, very similar. So let's go brighter on one. And there you go. You can see how the noise node is breaking up these two color nodes. Okay. From this point, what I'll do is probably up the octaves. Let's try 8. And it's just going to make this a bit more detailed. We'll go omega 0.8, and it's going to break this up in a more interesting way. And obviously the contrast is way too intense, so I'll just set that to 5. And this is looking a little too milky, a little too cloudy for me. So let's just adjust our colors a little bit. And that is a very, very subtle difference in the colors here. I want to scale this up though. I want to scale the noise up. So I'm going to select the noise, make a UV transform. I'll right click it, solo it so we can see what's going on. And I'll take the transform up to 2. And that's feeling a little bit better there. So now we have some nice inconsistency. It's very subtle, but I promise it'll pay off in our color channel there, okay? And you can right click the mix texture and auto arrange selected. It's a really nice way to clean that up. Next, we'll focus on the roughness, and the roughness controls how the reflections kind of bounce off of this material here. If I line this up at an angle where you can see it's basically like an iPhone screen right now, but if I crank this roughness up, it really spreads out the reflection. And what we're going for is something along these lines where parts of it feel wet and more reflective, and the other parts are more rough and the reflection is spread out. We're going to do a very similar trick here. We can use a noise node to do just that. And I'm going to pipe this projection node into our new noise node, and let's just pipe that into roughness. We'll right click, we'll solo it so we can see what's going on. And I'm gonna boost the contrast up to 5. And for this, I'm probably going to up the omega to 1. And the octaves, let's just try 10. We'll try turbulence maybe, or circular. I think circular could be nice. Let's just up the contrast so it's too bright. We'll bring the gamma down, or up rather, so we can get something a little bit more broken up like this. So let's see what that looks like. Awesome, so you can see how the noise node broke up our roughness channel here. Some parts of the surface are rough and others are more reflective. And you can take this, and I'm gonna make a new transform node. We'll scale it up. Let's go 2.5, and it's a little intense right now, so I wanna bring down the contrast just so it's broken up in a little bit of a different way here. And it's still looking a little cloudy, so we can come in here and adjust the gamma a little bit more, and that is actually feeling pretty nice to me. I know that this metal is warped a little bit because when I look back at the footage, I can see the reflections kind of bouncing over these like little hilly parts of the metal. So we'll actually do that with a noise node once again, and we'll pipe it into the bump channel. So I'll select both the transform and the noise, control drag, and pipe that into the bump. And you're definitely going to want to grab your projection and pipe that in as well. Okay, so right now it's too granular. It's too fine. We need to take the contrast to 0. And I'm feeling like, let's just reset our gamma. We'll go 2.2. The omega, we need to smooth this stuff out. So let's go 0.2, and octaves, we'll go 2. We can set this back to like per lens. Something like this is what we're going for. We want these nice, large, rolling reflections. So let's disable that. And we can actually compare and store our render buffer, right? So we have one side frozen, one side live. Now, if you guys want to go to the max here and really have more control over the power of all of your image inputs here, what we can do is grab out a multiply, pipe it right in there. We can grab a float and pipe that in. And float is basically just a number you can type in, which by default is set to 0.5. But let's say we go to like 5. And then it'll take whatever is in the bump channel and crank it up, in our case, by 10 times. Obviously, that's too much. I don't think we need that setup. We can just keep that at 1. But it's a nice trick to know when it comes to having more control over your image textures here. Now, as far as scratches go and inconsistencies in the paint buildup, let's talk about the paint buildup first. So I'm actually going to use a normal map to control the inconsistencies in the paint buildup. I'm just going to drag this in. This is from Megascans. Gotta love them. All right, and we're just going to put this into the normal channel. If we zoom in, we can actually see some really intricate detail here in the paint. It looks like it's actually kind of painted on here. Now, the last things as far as texturing goes for this demonstration is scratches, and this can really, really make your texture shine, and it's probably my favorite part of the whole process. We're actually going to mix two textures together in order to achieve that scratched look. Basically, you have your painted metal here, and then it's scratched away and eroded away to see this nasty old rust. But I want to do it with an actual kind of like shiny metal, more so like these little details here on the side. So to do that, let's briefly make the shiny metal material. We'll do that by making a new glossy material in Octane. We'll double click and we'll go down to the index, set that to 1. And just like the chrome ball, that's going to turn it into a chrome material here. So we'll apply it to the top, and you can see, sure enough, it's a chrome material. We want to mix these two together with a mix material in Octane. So let's give ourselves some room, and we can see here that it's looking for material 1 and material 2. So I'm going to drag the glossy material, the chrome material, into material 1, and we'll drag our paint material into material 2. Okay, so let's double click and go into the mix material, hop into node editor. If you guys aren't using the node editor at this point, definitely try and get here, because you can actually see all the stuff that's going into your material. It's very, very helpful. And this kind of setup here, it's a little messy, but you can always right click stuff and just clean things up with the auto arrange selected feature. It's really, really nice. Okay, so we basically have our chrome material here and our paint material right here. And it's mixing between these two, once again by default, with a float texture set to 0.5. And let's apply the mixed material to our geometry. So right here we have a fantastic scratched surface imperfection that we're going to use to mix between the chrome and the paint. Let's bring this in, let's get rid of this float texture, and let's pipe this into the amount. Let's right click it first, we'll go to solo node to see what's going on. Now we always want to give it a projection node and reset that to box. And let's go ahead and give it a UV transform so that we can scale it up and down. I think we can take this and work the gamma so that more of the scratch texture comes through. And there we go. When you drop the gamma down, you can really see that material come through. And that looks super awesome. So definitely don't miss out on the surface imperfections because they're going to get you closer to that photoreal look. There's definitely no such thing as a perfectly clean object, unless you're doing like product photography or something. But that's just a whole nother game. So before we render, you'll just want to duplicate your texture, change some attributes, and texture up the rest of your model. And before you render this thing out, you always want to check your source footage for motion blur and make sure you match it in your render. I usually like to render my motion blur outside of Cinema 4D just because you get those true highlights, maintaining their full light values across the motion blur streak. And if you guys aren't rendering as image sequences here, you definitely want to make sure you do that. It's kind of a built-in redundancy. It's going to make sure that if your computer crashes or whatever, you have those backup images and you'll just start it from the next image you left off on. So under save, I will just go to OpenEXR usually. 16 or 32-bit should be fine. And make sure you have alpha channel checked. So when you drop this in, it's going to be super nice and easy to composite. All right, so as promised, I'm going to walk you guys through the Redshift equivalence of all the different Octane nodes that I was using. It's very, very simple, and I'm very new to Redshift, but I picked this up pretty quick, so I think you guys can as well. If you create a Redshift material, right, I already have one made. I'm going to double click and go into the shader graph. So the first thing you notice, if you're familiar with Espresso, the Redshift shader graph looks very, very similar. In fact, it's basically the same thing. And let's just take this piece by piece and break down this very simple texture. Just like Octane, I dragged and dropped my image textures into this window, and that's all of these yellow nodes here. You got your ambient occlusion, your albedo, roughness, specular, normal, displacement, all that good stuff. Pretty simple, right? Now over to the left here, you can type in anything you want, and it's going to search through this node list. For example, I used a ramp, which is the same thing as a gradient or levels if you're in Photoshop or After Effects. And you can just type that in here and drag it out, right? And you're just going to pipe your nodes into each other, just like this. And you can edit your attributes here on the right side. Again, very, very similar to Octane. All the same techniques apply across the board. Let's say you want to drop the brightness value of your texture. Let's try a color correct node. That's what I have right here. And all you're going to do is just maybe drop your level scale, and it's going to adjust the brightness of your diffuse map or whatever you want to apply this color correct node to. And very similar to Octane, when you're piping in your displacement, you're going to want to use a displacement node as well. So you would just come into the search bar here, type displacement, grab your displacement node, pipe that in, and you'd pipe that into the output. You're just going to drag this node right up into here. And boom, displacement, it's already set and you're good to go. And the same is true for normal in Redshift. You'll want to use a bump map and use that as your input straight into your bump input on your Redshift material. And for this very simple render, all I'm doing is lighting it with a Redshift dome light, and that's going to allow us to pipe in an HDRI image right here inside of General. You would just find your HDRI, load it right in. Lastly, let's just talk about a shadow catcher and how easy that is inside of Redshift. You can see I have a shadow catcher set up, and it's actually really cool. All you want to do in Redshift is just give your object a Redshift object tag here. You'll go to Matte, you'll override, you'll enable in General, you'll scroll down and enable your shadow, and your shadow catcher is all set. So it's actually very simple, guys. All of the same tips and tools and techniques across the board apply for all the different renderers. So whatever I'm doing in Octane, you guys can do in Redshift as well, no problem.
Okay guys, and now for the fun part. This is when we're going to bring everything together. We're going to go inside of After Effects and we're going to composite this thing. We're going to match the shadows, the highlights, We're gonna match those midtones, we're gonna get the hue, saturation, we're gonna add some grain, and really make this thing feel like it fits inside of our live action plate.
So let's double click in the project window here to load up our image sequence, and navigating to any one of these V2 images, and you will make sure that our OpenEXR sequence box is checked, and that's just going to ensure that it brings in all the frames here. I'm going to double click and grab a V3 as well. I rendered one out with no glass, and we'll composite those together. Let's go ahead and drag in our footage, and we note that it's shot at 23.976. We can right click our image sequence, go to interpret footage and main, and double check that this is indeed set to 23.976. So let's drag that in, and our footage is 4K, the render is 1080. I'm just going to hit Shift F, and that's going to fit it to the composition. But if you notice, there is this white halo around our render, and that's caused by just the way After Effects is looking at the alpha here. So we'll want to go back to interpret footage and change the alpha to straight unmatted, and you can see that line just go away. So that's a thing that I always do when bringing in renders from Cinema 4D. I'll drop in our no glass render, and you guys should see here that it's just looking straight through to the street. And the reason I did that is because for some reason our specular material is acting like a mirror, and we don't want to do that. So we want to have full control over the opacity of that reflection. And all we need to do is have our other render at the bottom and then work the opacity just so it matches our reference footage. And now we can select both of these. We can hit Control-Shift-C to pre-compose these two image sequences together. We'll move all attributes and hit OK. All right, our track looks super solid here. We definitely need to composite this render. The lighting is a little intense, the saturation is a bit intense, and the shadow is too dark. So how do we know exactly what values we need to hit other than eyeballing it? So if we go up to this little window here, the info panel on the top right, you can see HSB for hue, saturation, and brightness. We also have alpha. And if we reference over the actual newspaper stand, we can see that the saturation and brightness are sitting right around 46, 47 kind of area. So we can compare that to our render, which is definitely not hitting those numbers. And we want to adjust it so that those numbers match. The first thing we'll do is adjust the saturation. So let's just find hue and saturation, drag it on there. So this saturation is at 47, 48. Our saturation is at 70. So let's try -30. A little bit further. And that feels about right to me. Now the biggest thing is the black levels here. We can see that the black levels on our render are way darker than the actual source footage. So let's go ahead and grab some levels. And I'll actually move the hue and saturation below the levels. So we'll do this level adjustment first. And I'm just going to crank this slider until this is looking right. The brightness is 10, 11 on this, and it's about 10 on ours. So I'd say that matches. In terms of the brightness of our actual newspaper stand, that's at 59. This is at 48. So let's just bring this slider down. And now the highlights can be a little intense as well. So we'll want to check those highlights too. So we're going to want to bring this down until we get that to like a 70. Yeah, that's not bad at all. So this feels pretty good to me minus the shadow. It feels a little bit dark. And actually this is not quite fully opaque. So we can go to our alpha settings here and adjust these and just give our shadow a little bit more brightness here. Two last things we can do here to make this render really shine and blend into our footage. Let's take a look at these shadows. And you can see this noise specifically in the shadows of our live action plate here. Now, if we go to our render, we can see that it's just perfectly smooth. There's no noise at all. We can just search for noise and drop that into our render. Give it something like 3%, maybe 5%. You always want to add noise. Always match the noise. You can do that with a match grain effect as well, but it's a lot more render intensive. And finally, there is a super subtle slight bloom in the highlights in footage. It's not super apparent here, but when the sun is striking something pretty harshly, it definitely kind of washes out and diffuses out the highlights. And you can replicate that in your render by duplicating it, throwing an extract filter on it, and we'll just work this bottom slider. Let's actually solo it. So we're getting rid of everything except for the highlights. So right around here, it's just the newspaper, and at a certain point, the top of our newspaper stand when it's getting hit by the sun, and we can work the bottom slider just to kind of feather that out. And if we bring everything back in, we can set this to something like screen and throw a fast blur on it, and we drop the opacity down to something like 15. And it's so subtle, but these effects will go such a long way and really help blend in your CG elements to your live action plates.
All right, guys, so that was a lot over the last 55 minutes. So we talked about shooting your footage and what to watch out for. We brought it into Cinema 4D and we tracked it. We talked about different ways to get nice tracks out of C4D. We then lit our scene using an HDRI, and we combined it with a sun, all right? From that point, you set up your shadow catcher, and then you're good to start modeling or dropping in your CG objects. So we started modeling with a blockout. Always start with a blockout because it saves us a lot of time. Then you go into detail, all right? Once you have your model, we're gonna texture it. We talked about surface imperfections and how important those are to making your model look photoreal. Before you render, make sure you match your motion blur to your plate. Always render your motion blur outside of Cinema 4D because you get those real nice highlights. And from that point, we talked about compositing inside of After Effects. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed this last hour. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your morning to spend it with myself. Thank you to Maxon for allowing me to present here at SIGGRAPH. And if you guys enjoyed this, then please head on over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Punisher. I'm getting into Cinema 4D, I'm getting into After Effects, and I'm getting into Unreal Engine. So come on over and let's get learning together. Thank you guys. Peace.